You might get away with it at first, but I promise you, you will get caught, even if they don't say anything to you directly. And it will create a bored or worse, a toxic feeling at the table. Want to know how to create a players versus DM toxic mentality for your table? Let the players think that you're cheating them behind the DM screen, because you'll be there in no time.
So I do have my own story regarding this mechanic. Again, I'm not championing it like he says. I'm not saying that this is an okay thing to do. You should be doing this like every big bad boss fight or whatever. I'm just saying that the examples are not addressing his core complaint, which is that boosting a monster's hit points takes away from player agency and makes your players feel as if it doesn't matter. For example, in a one-shot or a linear game, a lot of times the big bad is the climax of the story. It's the final thing, right? I find if the players defeat the monster too quickly, the game is over too quickly and they don't get to play anymore. Which, is that now more fun? Is that honoring their agency that you don't get to play anymore because the fight is over too quick? I don't think that just doubling their hit points for ha-has is the best solution for it. And I think that when it comes to maximizing your players' enjoyment, I don't think that the best thing to do is just be like, well, you guys won, time to go home, bye. That's what I had for you tonight. Hello everyone, this is John from Incendium D&D. So this morning I woke up to a notification on my phone that one of my favorite D&D content creators had uploaded a new video. So this is Cody from Taking 20, and the video is bad Dungeon Master advice and better options instead. Now, I'm always really interested in just DM advice in general. I myself have seen my fair share of bad DM advice, but I was really curious what this bad DM advice was, and if I shared Cody's thoughts and opinions on it. And there was a lot of stuff I agreed with him on. There was some stuff I disagreed with him on. It was enough that it made me want to give some kind of commentary and context to a lot of the arguments. And I figured we could do a little reaction video here, and we kind of go through everything together. So, let's get started.
So guys, I came across a Twitter post that kind of made me cringe with some advice for Dungeon Masters. And look, this isn't an attack video or something, okay? This is not about the person who made the comment, because I saw that this particular Twitter post had kind of like blown up in the D&D 5e community, and there were a lot of people supporting and echoing this advice like it was something to be championed for DMs running games of Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, so for the second time, all right, I want to reiterate that this isn't...
So yeah, before we get too far into the actual content of the video, I think that this is really important to say. One of the things I like about Cody's tone, and also just to, again, I shout him out a lot, but it's so true. Chris from Treant Monk, his tone too. A lot of times these reaction videos or these analysis videos are really just examining and analyzing an argument, not an attack on the person making the argument. And I want to make it clear that there are going to be some points here that I disagree with Cody on, but that isn't to attack his channel, attack his character, anything like that. And a lot of it, I think, is actually, I would agree if the context was a little different, which is what we're going to address. But that's the key thing here. I want to make it very clear that in my reaction to his reaction to something he saw, this also is not an attack video. And I think that, you know, whether it's D&D or just life, healthy debate, healthy discourse is extremely helpful for, you know, bettering yourself and positively contributing to the culture of your surroundings, whether it be your table or your group of friends, anything like that. So anyway, moving on.
An attack on this individual, and I don't think that this young individual is a terrible DM, and I would ask you guys not to hunt down this post and harass anyone about it, okay? Seriously, please be cool, YouTube community. But let me show you guys what this post said, and I want to talk about why this is really, it's one of the worst rookie mistakes I think you can make as a Dungeon Master at the table. And then I want to give you guys some better alternatives to approach this situation and issue instead, okay? So here is the advice to Dungeon Masters, and here's what it said. Dungeon Masters out there who get upset when your party kills your baddie too fast, just double their HP mid-fight. Who's gonna know? No one's gonna know. Okay, so that's...
Alright, so before he dives into his stuff, alright, I'm gonna be honest, I've watched this whole video already. Do I think that this is the most egregious thing you can do as a DM? No, I definitely think that really what you're doing is fudging a monster's HP, and I'm pretty against fudging in general. I think that there is a case to be made for specific circumstances. I do think it's different to fudge a monster's hit points, not necessarily like their armor class or saving throws or anything. I think things like fudging die rolls can have a harmful effect on your table. Do I think that this is a rookie mistake? Maybe. I think that it's kind of a crude fix to another underlying problem, which is the fact that perhaps the way that you set up the encounter was not completely thought through, or you just, as a dungeon master, didn't have a good sense of how much damage your party could do. But anyway, let's continue on.
It's basically the core concept of this video. Is it okay to buff enemies in the middle of a fight? To change stats to make it harder on players in the middle of a fight? Why can't we just fudge stuff behind the screen? If players are doing better than you thought they would, you know, what harm could possibly come from that? We'll just, you know, we'll secretly adjust the fight to go as long as it needs to. Who would even know? No one's gonna know. Please, please, please heed my advice here, Dungeon Masters, and please don't do this. First and foremost, it breaks the golden rule of the Dungeon Master screen. You never, ever, ever cheat against your players with the DM screen.
That is extremely important. I think that I've definitely been a player with a DM, and all of the players have gotten the sense, like talking afterwards, yeah, the DM definitely fudged stuff in their favor, and that always feels, it feels weird because there is an asymmetrical power dynamic at the table. The Dungeon Master has more power than the player characters do, and so when a player character either surprises the Dungeon Master or they do something that's more effective than the Dungeon Master predicted, for the Dungeon Master to just say, well, my secret big bad or my secret item or whatever can, like, wriggle their way out of this. That's completely legitimate advice. If you're gonna fudge things, it should be in your player's favor. Now, I don't think that in your player's favor means, like, leaning toward your player's, like, advantage, right? I think that there are times where, say, a fight is way too hard and you didn't realize how difficult it was. I still think that fudging things in their favor might not take the form of, say, debuffing your monster. It may not mean that, you know, they suddenly have a combat advantage that allows them to win more easily. I think it is a very astute observation that to cultivate a healthy culture at your table, as the DM, don't really want to cheat behind the screen, especially in your favor. As the DM, it's going to foster a lot of animosity at the table, and it's going to defeat the purpose of the game, which is to have fun and tell a great story, or whatever the core values that you imagine your particular D&D group championing.
That's not what it's there for. It never was. And if you think the DM screen is there so that you can fudge rolls or stats with abandon, it might behoove you to recalibrate that line of thinking. Veteran Dungeon Masters know the truth, okay? The screen isn't there to cheat your big bad monster's saving throw, which is basically the exact same thing as nonchalantly doubling the monster's HP in the middle of...
Sorry, I just really don't see them as the same thing. I think that, like, hit points and a saving throw bonus, they serve two very different functions in the game's mechanics and the game's storytelling. I'm not quite sold on that argument that fudging a saving throw is the same as offering a boost to hit points
of a fight to make it longer. It's there to protect your players from your mistakes. That's it. It's there so if you realize that you've thrown too much at the party or have made an egregious error, you can prevent your mistake from ruining the game, not the other way around. Secondly, if you're upset that your big bad monster is going down too fast and that the fight needs to be extended with HP, you are stealing your player's agency, which is arguably the single worst thing you can do as a Dungeon Master.
Yeah, there's the key thing right there. The core of Cody's argument in this video is that fudging a monster's hit points, in this case doubling it as the Twitter post put, is robbing your players of their agency. That being said, if you design a fight that's too difficult, is it not also robbing their agency to fudge things in their favor, right? So part of your player's agency is the choices and consequences that those choices have. So if they get into a fight with something that's too difficult, or if you threw something that's too difficult, rather than fudging it in their favor, why not present a scenario where they have a choice between fighting and not fighting, as opposed to trying to fight and dying? So, and I think that's the key thing, where player agency is a kind of buzzword when it comes to D&D advice. And I really think that a lot of times we have to define what player agency is. I find that players like different things about Dungeons and Dragons. For me, a lot of it comes down to my ability as a player to make choices that are not necessarily covered by the rules. So, for example, a lot of people will praise open world games like Skyrim or Witcher for being able to make a lot of different choices, but your choices are actually still constrained by the programming of the engine, whereas the only limit that player choices in a TTRPG have is the collective imagination and agreements at the table. So I think that to also say you can fudge in your player's favor, in a way, is taking away from maybe consequences of their decisions, or it's taking away an opportunity for them to make an unconventional decision, like, say, parlaying with a monster that's overwhelming, or finding an escape, or something else like that.
That nothing you do as a Dungeon Master is going to break a group down faster or ruin a campaign faster than a Dungeon Master stealing their players' agency. The moment, and I mean the moment, your players feel like their choices no longer matter, guys, it's hard to recover from that. And it's the exact same reason D&D players hate railroading. Everyone who has played D&D has experienced railroading before, and every DM has been guilty of it, okay? Myself 100% included in that. Mercer, Perkins, Crawford too, okay? It's a rite of passage as you learn the game.
Yeah, I think that that's actually something really key to take away from this whole video. A lot of DMs I know will beat themselves up for making mistakes, like unbalancing an encounter or finding out that they railroaded and they didn't really mean to. And I think that making mistakes as a rite of passage is a really healthy way to look at it. It's not an excuse for the fact that you may have made an unskillful decision, but it's forgiveness for the fact that you are going to make mistakes and you are going to mess up. I do want to just kind of define railroading, because again, this is another one of those D&D buzzwords that I think means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Railroading is where your players don't have a choice. Linear adventures just means there is a linear sequence of events that your characters are following. And I don't think that a linear game is necessarily railroaded in the sense that Cody is talking about here. One of the things he keeps saying too is, does the fight need to be this long? Does it need to be like 5 rounds or whatever? I do think that analyzing the amount of rounds that players get to play can be a helpful metric for determining how balanced your encounter might be. That doesn't mean that if you did 5 rounds of combat, your combat was really amazing or memorable or challenging or whatever word you want whatever outcome you're looking for. But yeah, the idea is that I think railroading gets a lot of flack, and even linear design can be mistaken for railroading. So I think it's helpful to keep all of these terms clearly defined so that way you're not losing out on the benefit of, say, a structured adventure. Also, like I said, part of the table's culture are the agreements that all of the players and the DM make before, during, and after the game. What I found for my table is most of my players agree a linear adventure is a lot more fun for them. If I were to try to do an open adventure where I'm like, well, what do your characters want to do, and not really give them a lot of clear hooks, they would find that frustrating, and they have found that frustrating in the past. So it's just something to keep in mind that everyone does have different preferences, and I think this fear of railroading can actually restrict the type of really fun, engaging games you could possibly have at your table.
The reason it's thought of with such vitriol is because the players feel like they don't have agency, that their choices don't matter. If you are approaching a combat with your players with the mindset that the fight needs to be at least 5 rounds, at least 3 rounds, at least 8 rounds, or it's not fun, and you cheat in the middle of the fight to make that happen, you're basically saying it didn't matter with what choices your players made, that they had no agency to begin with. If your monster had 80 hit points and the party had bad rolls in the first few rounds so that you didn't have to change anything, versus your monster having 80 hit points and the player's critting twice early, so, oh no, you need to change your monster's hit points to 160 now. You are saying that the game, the dice, the spells, the choices that your players made weren't relevant. You've
Out of everything he says in the video, this is the point I want to contend with the most. I am so on board with talking about player agency and choices and whether doubling a monster's hit points make your player characters feel like their choices matter or don't matter. Totally here for that conversation. But your example can't now be your players rolled bad or your players rolled good, because rolling has nothing to do with player agency. Your players aren't deciding whether they critically fail or critically succeed or get a critical hit. That is an outcome of the dice. And to me, this is a good conversation to have, honoring the integrity of die rolls, but that is a separate conversation than player agency. And he's going to bring it up later in the video. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. There's a whole different conversation between, your monster has 80 hit points. Your players get 3 crits in a row and deal at 150 damage out of nowhere. That's a different conversation than your players create a very clever plan that traps the monster and takes away its action economy so that way they can deal it damage without it being able to fight back. Those are two completely separate conversations. One of them is about the luck of the roll. One of them is about the players making choices that make the fight easier as a consequence. So, and I just want to keep that clear, because I do think that, again, when we're talking about fudging, the random element of D&D can throw a lot of things in. And I think that if the core of your argument is about player agency, then stick to player agency. Stick to the actual choices they can make, not the random results of the die rolls that they're going to make.
Stolen their agency and are no longer playing Dungeons and Dragons and are now just telling a story at them. Thirdly, and I want to emphasize this, okay, particularly because of this line, who's gonna know, no one's gonna know, is just categorically not true. Again, guys, I'm not saying this to pick on this person, okay? I don't think that they are the worst DM ever of all time ever out in the Twitterverse ruining games, all right? But let's talk about this. This just isn't true, and it's something that didn't click with me personally until I experienced it from the other side of the DM screen, all right? I used to think exactly.
Before diving into the bigger point that he's making at the moment, which is, are your players going to know? I want to just highlight, I think that this is going to be a part of the video that gets overlooked, but I think it's extremely important. I didn't understand what it was like until I was on the other side of the screen. That's huge. I DM pretty regularly. As a counterbalance to that, I also make sure I try to play very regularly. I've talked to a lot of dungeon masters that they love DMing so much they really don't like being a player. I've even seen some DMs that are like, yeah, I'll play or whatever, but you can tell that they're uncomfortable. Part of that, I feel, is a power dynamic thing. Again, it's good to feel in control of the story and like know everything that's going on. But I do think that to be a better DM, you have to understand how your players are thinking and where they're coming from, both intellectually and emotionally. And so I think one of the healthiest things you can do is make sure to sit on both sides of the screen. I don't think it's as necessary, but I think it can be helpful for players to DM a one-shot, to understand the emotions their DM is going through when trying to, corral everyone, keep the game moving, trying to keep everyone entertained. It leads to a lot of empathy on both sides of the screen, which again contributes to a healthier culture at your table.
Like this, so I'm not throwing stones, but with experience, as I got closer to that 10,000 hours, right? Okay, I learned the hard way that this isn't true. Players will absolutely know. I had a story I've told before 3 or 4 years ago where I had a GM back in my Pathfinder First Edition days that approached combat like this, okay? It doesn't really matter what all the background was, but the short of it was that my character tried to do something that I was excited about, and the GM was obviously upset that I was going to shorten his big bad boss encounter with something kind of clever. So called for a roll. I rolled like a 19 or something, and with all my bonuses, the big bad boss had literally almost no plausible way to avoid this thing that I was trying to do. After initially saying it failed, he finally decided to let the thing happen, only to have the big bad immediately undo my clever ploy and continue attacking us as though it never happened and it didn't matter on the baddie's immediate next turn. And to say that it was a frustrating feeling, that the GM was basically forcing X amount of combat rounds with his big bad, is an understatement. And this might seem like an extreme example, but it's not. Or hell, I don't know, maybe it is. But the point's the same. If you approach combats like they have to have a round quota to meet before your players can win, regardless of how well the players might be doing, they will be able to tell. Sure.
So honestly, his player agency argument makes a lot of sense here. He should have led with this story. And I've definitely been in his shoes with a DM acting that way as well, where you're, as a player, maybe you Nova, you're a paladin, you use your highest level smite, or you use those once per long rest abilities from your subclass, and you try to deal a massive amount of damage, really blitzkrieg the big bad right out of the gate. And for whatever reason, the DM rules that your thing didn't work because they want to preserve the sanctity of their big bad creature. I completely understand this, the frustration he's talking about. And yes, that is robbing player agency. It's why I hate mechanics like legendary resistance. Here we're plugging Emery's again. There is a mechanic in 5e that basically lets that happen. I force the big bad to make this saving throw against this really big effect that I have. Maybe it's a 6th, 7th, 9th level spell. Oh, my big bad uses a legendary resistance and your thing doesn't work. That is an extremely frustrating feeling. I really understand what he's saying here. Now, do I think that fudging your monster's hit points mid-fight is the same thing as this? That's a little different, right? Even in this story, he's saying that he forced the big bad to make a saving throw, or he, stacked his modifiers. He made a lot of choices to make something happen. That's not necessarily the same thing as just giving it a few more hit points, right? And so I do have my own story regarding this mechanic. Again, I'm not championing it like he says. I'm not saying that this is an okay thing to do. You should be doing this like every big bad boss fight or whatever. I'm just saying that the examples are not addressing his core complaint, which is that boosting a monster's hit points takes away from player agency and makes your players feel as if it doesn't matter. Now, that being said, he does address something here that I think is worth noting.
You might get away with it at first, but I promise you, you will get caught, even if they don't say anything to you directly. And it will create a bored or worse, a toxic feeling at the table. Want to know how to create a players versus DM toxic mentality for your table? Let the players think that you're cheating them behind the DM screen, because you'll be there in no time.
Absolutely agree. This is what creates a culture of animosity at your table. This is what breeds rules lawyers behavior. Rules lawyering, a lot of the times I found, is encouraged when it feels like a DM is quote unquote cheating, especially in their favor. A lot of times I've actually done the opposite, where a DM tries to fudge for the player's benefit, and now the game is not challenging. So even though it's to our benefit, it feels like our choices don't matter because the DM wants us to win. So I've seen it in both directions. I don't think that, cheating for your big bad or cheating for the players, either way it ends up weird. Now, that being said, a lot of players don't like this, by the way, so this is not, again, championing a cause. I found as a DM, I tend to be pretty transparent with stuff. So after a fight, like, a party might say, like, wow, that was tougher than I expected. Or I'll just come out and say, hey, by the way, I boosted the monster's hit points at the end there, because it was going a little too quick. That is something I wanna say. I think one of the core things we have to agree on at the outset of all this stuff is, what style of game are we going for? Like, what is the outcome? Cody's going to talk about in a few examples. He's going to talk about things like dungeon crawling and, more open design rather than linear design. For example, in a one-shot or a linear game, a lot of times the big bad is the climax of the story. It's the final thing, right? I find if the players defeat the monster too quickly, the game is over too quickly and they don't get to play anymore. Which, is that now more fun? Is that honoring their agency that you don't get to play anymore because the fight is over too quick? I don't think that just doubling their hit points for ha-has is the best solution for it. And I think that when it comes to maximizing your players' enjoyment, I don't think that the best thing to do is just be like, well, you guys won, time to go home, bye. That's what I had for you tonight. He does get into, again, this is called "and other solutions" or whatever the title is. But a lot of times, if you try to be sneaky with things like doubling a creature's hit points or fudging its saves, gosh, anything like that, that is going to breed a culture of animosity. If you're transparent about some of the things that you did, like, hey, I adjusted this mid-fight, or even better, if you have a story reason for it, like maybe your big bad creature, like, I don't know, tapped into magic crystals behind them and that gave them a boost. Whoa! Like, what? Now all of a sudden, if there's a story reason behind it, your players aren't going to be as upset about it. We're going to get into that a little bit later into the video, like I said. But yes, it will breed animosity if you're being secretive as a DM or you're being sneaky. If you're being transparent about some of the adjustments that you're making and you're being open about the fact that you're proud of your players for, dealing way more damage than you expected, then yeah. You also have to look at, why are you tempted to fudge in certain ways and what led to that. For example, if I was tempted to fudge a creature's hit points, like an enemy's hit points, usually it's because I misestimated my player's damage output. There have been times where, say, I'm like, oh, my players can do an average of 30 points of damage per round, and they end up doing like 80 damage per round, and it's like, oh, yikes, right? There's been other times I've been like, they can do like 30 damage per round, and they end up doing like 8 or 10, and now it's like, yikes. So again, the more you play with certain characters, like certain builds, the more you're going to be able to predict how effective those builds are going to be in play. And now you can more intentionally design encounters that are going to be appropriate, right?
And fourthly, guys, doing this is not just stealing your player's agency, right? It's stealing their moment. Do you want to know what I personally try to accomplish when I run games of Dungeons & Dragons? I want to create moments that everyone at the table will remember when they lay down to sleep later that night. I want memories that we can all look back and talk about and laugh about a year later, 3 years later, hell, 10 years later. And what do you think your players are going to remember more? The Hydra that you wouldn't let die so you increase the HP, so you dragged combat on for a full 10 rounds? Or that time where they absolutely pummeled that Lich in just 2 turns, then countered the Lich's spell to escape and finished him off. And how excited they all were after being terrified of him for maybe months of a campaign before they got to him and just ended up wrecking him.
This is, again, another part where I don't disagree, but I think there's more into these examples we can dive into. I absolutely agree that as a DM, the thing you should be paying attention to isn't the damage exchange or the values or your player's armor class. It's how excited they are about certain moments. And yeah, there'll actually be times where, let's say, if I do fudge a monster's hit points, I might fudge it downward if my players did something really epic and exciting, and that moment is the moment that my creature should be destroyed, right? I totally have been there where, you know, the players do something really clever, or they do an all-out attack, and then the DM, for whatever reason, is like, well, again, I haven't hit that round quota, as Cody's been calling it. And so because of that, my creature isn't dead yet. I am not quite convinced on his second example, where, you know, the players have been terrified of this Lich for session after session, maybe months, maybe years of real world time, and so they wreck it in 2 rounds and that's done. Like, to me, that has the potential to be anticlimactic. I get the core of his argument, you know, maximize the amount of enjoyment at the table. I completely agree with that. Whether or not destroying the Lich in 2 rounds is creating the most enjoyment, I don't know. I would have to, again, I think that example needs some more context. There have definitely been times I've run games. I present a monster that seems overwhelming, and the players, through a combination of ingenuity and luck, are able to defeat it much more easily, much more epically, and they celebrate that. I think, again, we have to ask, who is this big bad? If this is like the end of a campaign, then maybe defeating the big bad in 2 rounds is not going to create the most exciting moment. I've actually been a part of Curse of Strahd twice. Once was as a player in Ian's game. Another was I actually ran it for myself. It sounds kind of lonely, because it is. But I ran a solo D&D game, and it was pretty fun, actually. But when I finally got to Strahd, I had 3 level 10 PCs. He didn't get anything off. Like, they completely annihilated him. And to me, looking at the arc of the story, you know, building up this fear of the great Count Strahd, the Devil Strahd, only to counter him with a Dawn spell and just the Sun Sword. And he didn't even really do a lot of damage or anything. Like, that didn't make for a more memorable climax to that story arc. It's hard. I do think that I ultimately agree, probably shouldn't fudge or your monster's hit points. Although, that being said, before we dive further into this video, I distinctly remember a Todd Kenrick interview with Jeremy Crawford where Crawford said the reason there's an average hit points and then like a die amount next to those hit points in parentheses is specifically so that DMs can fudge hit points. So there is like a maximum amount of hit points a creature may reach. There's also an average. Pretty much the way I do it is if the players reach those average hit points, if they've been having a hard go of it, then that's when I'll end the encounter. If they reach those average hit points a little bit too early, I'll then start looking at the max hit points. And anywhere in between those max hit points and those average hit points, if there is a moment where the players, the end of the combat would be super epic there, that's where I do the how do you want to do this. So there's not like a set amount of hit points that the players are trying to reach. Really, I'm open with this with my players, each creature usually has a range of hit points. And depending on what the story is like, what the descriptions are like, how well they're rolling, again, all this stuff, that's when I'll determine the end of the combat. So it's not really fudging, it's really like making sure that the power of the story and the mechanical hit point range that the creature could be defeated in, I just make sure that those match up as best I can game by game. And sometimes I get it wrong. And also, I'm not using a DM screen to hide that. I'm usually pretty open with my players that, yeah, this is the way I do hit points, just to let you know.
Okay, let's shift tone here, right? Okay, cheating the players is not the right approach. So, what can we do instead? Besides just letting it happen and laughing along with your players, which is perfectly fine and often the right choice. There are
True.
some other ways that you can cheat fairly that won't steal your players' agency. The first
I don't like that term, but we'll see what he has to say.
way that you can cheat fairly is to take the story in a different direction. Okay, your big bad boss just died like a chump. What now? Well, the easiest way to cheat this fairly is to tweak your backstory and create a newer, bigger boss that was really pulling the strings the whole time.
That's not cheating, that's storytelling.
Doesn't feel fair enough? Fine. Come up with a new, bigger, badder villain that was completely unassociated with your previous big bad evil guy and have them show up in the campaign to take whatever rewards the players have now received. What if the big bad was doing his or her own thing and they had an even scarier, more powerful sister who now wants revenge on the party? What if someone has been spying on the big bad evil guy? And when the players show up and so easily dispatch the powerful foe, well, now the god of chaos is delighted and lures the players onto an island with all sorts of horrors and other powerful warriors on your world to fight to the death for survival. Instead of cheating your players and extending a fight and robbing them of their moment, use it as a catalyst to expand your campaign. Your big bad monster is dead? Great! Let the players be heroes. Then pull the rug out from under them so fast it makes their heads spin. If your main plot seems anticlimactic, fine. Your players didn't rob you of an epic fight because they did too good. No. They threw.
Ooh. I do want to pause there because, again, I feel like this is a really powerful thing that might get easily overlooked. This is a mindset thing. There's been lots of times I've talked to DMs, and they might not even say it in these words, but this is definitely the tone. My players robbed me of XYZ, of an epic fight, of a big villain moment, of a great story moment. This idea that as the DM, you deserve something. And I know, it sounds kind of harsh because your DM is doing a lot of work. As asymmetrical as the power dynamic is, they're also putting in the most effort at the table. They're under the most amount of pressure. Yeah. As the DM, your role is as a game designer, as a neutral arbiter of the rules, as someone there to cultivate a positive culture. And if at all that thought or feeling crosses your minds of, I was robbed of something, there is something much deeper to address in terms of your DMing philosophy and mental habits than there are of, did you double the creature's hit points or whatever. The reason I wanted to react to this video is I think Cody has deeper points than the surface level expression, which is fudging die rolls or fudging a monster's hit points, all that kind of stuff. The deeper thing is, what does the DM think their role is? Do they think they're just another player? Do they think they're there to serve their players? I will tell you this right now. If you're a DM and your mindset is, I am here to serve my players, if that's truly your intention, you're not going to be thinking, I was robbed of a big fight. You're going to be thinking the reason why you would double their hit points is, I want to make sure my players feel like they've overcome a great challenge. And chances are, if that's the reason why you're doing it, you're not going to rob your players of their agency. You're going to want to make their choices feel more meaningful, that the defeat, the fall of the big bad is going to feel more meaningful. Now, that being said, he's absolutely right. There's lots of times your big bad dies way too easily, and we just have a big laugh about it. Oh, look, those natural 20s. Didn't see that coming. That's absolutely the right move a lot of the time. Also, again, I'm not really into this, you know, you're cheating fairly by extending the plot and saying there's another big bad guy behind the bad guy they just defeated, or they have an evil sister. That's just improvisational storytelling. That is the core conceit of what this hobby is. So I agree with his assessment. I just don't agree with the label that he's deciding to use. It's a very, very semantics-based argument, but, you know, semantics is something I get stuck on.
They threw off your shackles to that story and that plot, freeing you to take the story in any new direction you want now. But what if you want to stay in this campaign, and really what you want is to make this dungeon, this fight, more interesting? Okay, there are other ways that we can fairly cheat here as well. The second way to fairly cheat is to simply add another room. Okay, let's say hypothetically this was more of a mini boss now. Don't double its HP in the middle of a fight. Instead, have it break through a wall or crash through the floor, leading to a whole new area of the dungeon. Maybe the broodmother has an entire chamber of eggs ready to pop with hungry, smaller versions. Maybe your dungeon boss was secretly imprisoning and tainting a quaddle in a chamber behind their throne. Or maybe the big bad boss had chosen this area as a hideout because it has a huge vault locking away an entire city that sits below it. Or perhaps they just finished casting their ritual, breaking the seals of a great beast that they had planned to control, and with their dying breath they laugh because they know the players will have no way to control it now.
Yeah, again, his last example there was actually really good. Maybe the big bad villain was trying to summon something, and that's like the true big bad boss. I have nothing against that, definitely have used that one myself. I do think there is a few peripheral factors that you want to consider. This is one of the things that I feel like a lot of D&D advice people get stuck on, is thinking it in terms of D&D, not in terms of the real world. So for example, your players may only have a limited time to play. They want to wrap up the game by 9. It's like 8:20 and they defeat the big bad boss. Adding in 50 or 60 more hit points rather than creating a whole new room or revealing there's way more city might be more psychologically satisfying to just close the loop of the story, especially, again, if this is the end of a big story arc or a big, you know, loop that your players have kept open, maybe as a one-shot. It all calls back to the structure of the game you're running. If this is an ongoing campaign, dungeon crawl, anything like that, sure, go for it. But I do think that it warrants a conversation, again, about the context of how you would implement this advice.
To cheat fairly is really the biggest gray area of cheating, but it's still more fair than fudging hit points. And that's to give your big fight a second phase. The second phase is a great tool more dungeon masters should use because it does 3 things. First, it creates variance in the fight, which is always a positive. Secondly, it makes your world seem more interesting and magical. And thirdly, the most important, it gives your players a sense of accomplishment that giving your big boss a huge pile of straight hit points just doesn't do. They beat the first phase, they're winning, they're progressing the fight. Now, this is a little harder to pull off, but I'm gonna give you guys a little key here to it, all right? The moment you realize that the players are tearing through your big fight like tissue paper and that you decide you want to try this thing, stop and foreshadow it. Seriously, foreshadow it. So let's say you want to give your big strong boss a second phase that would include them turning into a demon. Okay, that's a strong second phase right there. Well, you need to foreshadow to your players that all may not be what it seems while they are still fighting. So perhaps a light in the room reveals the powerful foe has an odd-shaped shadow with wings and horns. Or maybe their eyes close sideways like the aliens in Men in Black. Or perhaps even you can see a crystal around their neck beginning to bleed and shatter and crack as the fight progresses. That way, when the boss drops to the ground huffing and puffing, you can have them stand up, ripping and stretching their outer skin as a huge winged demon appears for the second phase of the fight.
Yeah, so the first time I listened to this video, this was the thing going through my head the whole time. rather than saying don't double your monster's hit points, why not just have whenever you would double their hit points, why not just have that be a second phase of the fight? Now, I think that for DMs that get surprised and they feel compelled to double a monster's hit points, they probably haven't thought ahead to putting in a second phase to do the foreshadowing. So really, I think that this is like the core piece of advice of the video is it's all about the preparation leading into it. If you're gonna have a big bad boss, like think through a second phase that might happen that you might foreshadow, right? And if the players end up, say, the session has gone on too long, or like they are really clever, they've come up with a plan ahead of time, you can always take away the second phase and just have it be a standard boss fight that maybe goes a little quicker. And a lot of times I find that this is a great way to introduce a change in mechanics. One of the things that that I know I used to talk about with my little DM circle is that, let's say you're dealing a lot of damage to an enemy unexpectedly and it's whittling down their hit points way faster than they thought you would, right? Maybe they have a contingency plan where they get more hit points but at the cost of armor class, but also they hit harder. So there's just some kind of change. I really like his approach here of, if you thought of it, foreshadow it storytelling wise so it doesn't feel like a quick switcheroo. But also, I don't think that if you didn't do that preparatory work, this is a tool that you can't use.
And one more little trick that is along the lines of the last two tips, whether that's including another room or giving your boss a second phase, and that's to teleport everyone to another area. This can be used as both a non-optional phase, sucking every...
Alright, this is one part I contend. If the whole argument's premise is on player agency, the minute you say you don't give them a choice about teleporting to a new location, to me, there's a conflict there. I don't even hate the advice of, maybe crystals grow on the room and now you're in a new environment. But if the whole thing is being aware about your players' choices, telling them they don't have a choice, I feel like there's something to examine there.
Everyone in the room into a crystalline world where they have to fight the boss again with now new powers and a fresh set of hit points. Or even a more fair way to do this to your players is to make the teleporting optional. So if they see the villain being pulled into a portal into the shadow plane or a crystal as before, they can choose to follow or not. The reason that this is more fair is because that they have entered into this fight with expectations that you, as the Dungeon Master, have helped shape for them. So if you're going to start throwing wild stuff at them that you haven't hinted at or foreshadowed at all leading up to this point, it's only fair sometimes that you give them that choice to follow or not. Oh, and by escaping into a new area, I don't just mean automatically let your boss escape either. That sucks every bit as much, but it is fair to your players for the villain to try to attempt to escape. So if they take attacks of opportunities and drop before they make it into that portal, for instance, well, then now you have an open portal and no longer a villain to worry about, and you get to take the story in any direction you want. Or here's a cool idea: if they die trying to escape to the portal, just have their shadow stand up and out of their dead body and walk through the portal anyways. Or even have a cloaked figure with a scythe slowly walk through and collect the body, teleporting the players away if they try to interfere. There are a lot of things that you can do to make a scene or fight more interesting if it's too short, rather than just making the fight longer by lying about how much health the big bad has halfway through and stealing agency from your players. All you have to do is try something. And who knows, it might be that catalyst. It might be that catalyst from turning a good campaign into an epic campaign. All right, so now I want to pass it over to you.
All right, so that's the end of the video. Gotta hit that like button. So, A few other things that I went through the comments of this video just because I was curious what a lot of other people in the community had to say. One of the suggestions I saw in the comments that was brilliant is, if you're worried about your players chewing through the hit points of your big bad too much, give them minions. I remember one of the hardest encounters I set up for my players was, there was a warlock, and I think she had like 90 hit points or something, and they were all level 5, so it wasn't like that wild of an encounter, but I gave her 3 whites, and yeah, that was a tough encounter for my my players. So a lot of times by offering multiple targets, it can really spice up combat a whole lot. So definitely like keep minions in mind while you're designing encounters. Just as a personal testimonial, I usually do DM with that hit point range like I mentioned before, where there's usually between the average and the max. Somewhere in there is when I declare the fight is over. And just there is this one time I remember playing a game where my character, who was a rogue, had snuck aboard an airship. And in the airship were supposed to be the most powerful mages of a faction that our party was fighting against. And one of the things that we had decided to do was sabotage the airship's engines. So we went to the engine room, and my rogue went to knock out the NPC engineer. And my rogue ended up doing like 30 or 40 damage in the sneak attack, right? Literal sneak attack. Surprised him, tried to bonk him on the back of the head. The engineer didn't go down, and it ended up, we had to deal over 100 points of damage before we could knock out this NPC. And so one of the things I told the DM after the game was that I was very concerned about the way the rest of the encounters would go if a commoner NPC had over 100 hit points. What did that mean for like the mages? And I was very just concerned that our party was just gonna flat out die. Like if one of the weakest members of the ship had over 100 hit points, what does that mean for the rest of the world? So, and this was a case where the DM fudged the hit points in order for a specific storytelling moment. And it ended up taking away a lot of the fun of the game, and it left me as a player really frustrated. So yes, randomly fudging your monster's hit points can definitely lead to harm in the game. I think that it'll, again though, this was against a random NPC, and really what I was looking at as a player and what I was giving as feedback was, this is now informing me about the way the world works, and how is it that every NPC seems to have a bajillion hit points, when as a, like, 9th level player character, I have, like, 70, you know? So I think that, again, this is all about context. If it is the big bad of the night, especially if you just want to close the loop of whatever story you're currently playing. Let's say that it's just that something went a little awry. I think that giving a second phase, or maybe buffing the hit points a little, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, especially if the way you're thinking about it as a DM is, how do I create the most meaningful, powerful storytelling moments in service to my players? To agree with Cody at the very end here, it can go wrong more times than it can go right. So again, just to be clear, I really don't want to come across as attacking Cody, the content creator. I just think there were some ways that this argument was organized that I think could really help cut to the bigger questions that are ultimately being asked here. If you watch this video for yourself, please give it a like, please give it a subscribe, leave a comment. It's all good stuff here. I look forward to future releases from Taking 20. And if you like this format from us, where you get a little bit of commentary from other creators and other ideas and stuff, I think as a DM, even as a person, it's really helpful to look at other heavy hitters in your same field to improve yourself and to really give yourself deep questions to think about. So let us know in the comments down below, and have an awesome day, everyone. Bye-bye now.